We are in our virtual Zendo, business as usual in our virtual Zendo. So I will be continuing with the talks on the Dharma gates, gates of illumination. So again, just to refresh your memories, because we haven't been together for a few weeks, I've been talking on this text called 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination, which is in the 12 Fascicle version of Dogen's Shobogenzo. It's actually a long quote from another text, which was sort of picked up and set down into the Shobogenzo. This other text is the Sutra of the Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. So somehow these 108 gates have been included in Dogen Shobogenzo. So we've been looking at each one per week. We're up to number 27. So 27 is the three devotions are a gate of Dharma illumination, for they purify the three evil worlds. There we go. The three devotions are a gate of Dharma illumination, for they purify the three evil worlds. So as always, let's look first at the nature of the three devotions and what that's about, and then at their relationship with the three evil worlds and what the three evil worlds are doing here. So the three devotions are about taking refuge in the three treasures. So this is actually familiar territory, although we might not be used to thinking about it as three devotions. We're really talking about Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, our old friends, the three treasures. So Buddha, of course, is the historical Buddha, who was born in the world and taught us some things, but Buddha is also awakening itself. Dharma is what the Buddha taught, but it's also simply the way things are. The way the universe works, right? And Sangha is the community of people, virtual or in real life, who are practicing together. But in a big way, it also just means all beings. So this is the three treasures as we know them. This is familiar territory. Sometimes the three treasures are called the three jewels or the three gems, because gems are valuable and precious. And so back in the earliest days, these three treasures were considered very precious, important things, but also in ancient India, jewels were thought to have some protective powers, some protective qualities. We'll see in a minute why that's relevant here. So in the Buddhist calendar around the world, this is the time where we celebrate Buddha's birthday, traditionally April 8th. So if we were in our own Zendo, we would be doing some extra chanting. We would have some decorations and some things on the altar. We can't do it virtually. But it seems like, anyway, this is a good week to talk about Buddha and talk about the three treasures. When we hear the story of Buddha's life, we hear that he attained awakening under the Bodhi tree. So he sat down and said, I'm not getting up until I understand the nature of suffering. Came to some kind of awakening. And then he went to look for five men that he'd been practicing with before. And he wanted to share the Dharma with them, and so he shared the Dharma with them. They accepted these teachings from Buddha. They became Buddha's students, and this is when we can say that the three treasures were really established, because now there is a Buddha, there is an awakened being, there is the Dharma, because some teachings happened, and there's a Sangha, because 5 and now 6 people had come together to form a sort of community. So at this point, we can say we actually have three treasures in the Buddhist tradition. So Dogen Zenji says we take refuge in Buddha because Buddha is a good teacher, and we take refuge in the Dharma because the Dharma is good medicine. It can heal something going on for us. And we take refuge in Sangha because it's a group of good friends. And we need all of these three things in our lives as we walk this path together. So when we talk about taking refuge in the three treasures, that can seem a little strange, or that can seem a little bit Christian or something, right? But taking refuge is really important in the Buddhist tradition. So in the Japanese, the word is kie. So ki means to return or to go back to something. And a in this case means to depend on. So the three treasures are something we can keep returning to and depending on. We can rely on them in our lives and in our practice. So when we take refuge in the three treasures, it really means that we take these three treasures as the main guideline for how we live, right? This is where we look for guidance in how we go forward every day. So this idea of taking refuge goes way back to India before Buddha's time. Originally, it meant you were declaring allegiance to a powerful person or a patron. And in return, you were hoping to get some kind of protection from danger. So if you declared allegiance to this patron, you took this person's direction, did what this person directed you to do somehow, the exchange was you would be protected from things that might endanger you. So in the early years of Buddha's teaching, in his sort of early career, people who came to follow him adopted that tradition or sort of took on that approach to being with him. They expressed their allegiance to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But in the Buddhist context, this custom takes on a little bit of a different meaning. So taking refuge in Buddha is not asking Buddha's personal protection. You're not asking Buddha to intervene on your behalf somehow to protect you from danger. And yet still, we face dangers from the three poisonous mind. We want freedom from our suffering. We want liberation, right? So we're committing to the three refuges and to our practice because we recognize that we create our own suffering. So we're not committing to these things for some kind of outside help. We're committing to these things because we understand that the suffering we experience and sometimes perpetuate in the world is of our own making. It's something that we've created, and we're committing to cultivating wisdom and sort of skillful intentions about what we do with that so that we can keep suffering from arising. So we know that following the teachings will help us to do that. Looking to Buddha, Dharma, Sangha will help us to do that, and that's the basis of taking refuge. So there is some protecting going on. We hope we're practicing in a skillful way with some aspiration to keep suffering from arising and to keep from perpetuating it on other people. So we're protecting ourselves and also all beings in that way. So during some ceremonies, when life is normal at Sanshin, we do ceremonies like Refuge. And during those kinds of ceremonies, we chant the three refuges. So we say, I take refuge in Buddha, together with all beings, immersing body and mind deeply in the way, awakening true mind. I take refuge in Dharma, together with all beings, entering deeply the merciful ocean of Buddha's way. I take refuge in Sangha, together with all beings, bringing harmony to everyone free from hindrance. So we could spend the whole morning just unpacking this chant. There's a lot happening here. But let's look at it briefly in the context of our conversation today. So I take refuge in Buddha, together with all beings, immersing body and mind deeply in the way, awakening true mind. So immersing body and mind reminds us that awakening is only manifested when we actually enact it. We act it out with this body, moment by moment. It's not enough to just sort of intellectually study or pay attention to what Buddha is teaching and decide we agree with that and then not to do anything more. We have to completely embody this teaching. We have to completely embody awakening and completely awaken to this reality. So when we do that, our wisdom and our compassion that are already here naturally manifest, and we take some skillful action in the world, right? So this becomes activity. Practice is not something here. Practice is what we're actually doing with this body and mind. So to completely immerse ourselves and completely immerse body and mind deeply in the way is to not only understand, but somehow carry out these teachings. I take refuge in Dharma, together with all beings, deeply entering the merciful ocean of Buddha's way. So we study the teachings not only in the form of what Buddha said and what we have written down in sutra books, but also in the form of just the way the universe works. We just pay attention to the way things are, and that too is Dharma. So yes, sometimes we're doing a sutra study, or we're studying one of Hojo-san's books or something. We're getting together to discuss some kinds of teachings. But we also pay attention to reality, and we immerse ourselves in that reality. So there is no separation between ourselves and the rest of the universe. The reference to the ocean is a pointer toward taking the broadest possible view. So if we're somehow in a building or in a valley or on the land, our view is somewhat limited. It's like sort of being, we can't see 360 degrees. And yet if you're in a boat on the ocean, or you're even standing on the shore, you have a really broad view, right? There's nothing sort of limiting your view. So it's a pointer toward that kind of perspective, taking the broadest possible view, letting go of thoughts and views and delusions and ideas that limit our ability to just see clearly what's going on. I take refuge in Sangha together with all beings, bringing harmony to everyone free from hindrance. The words translated as bringing harmony actually have a connotation of unity. It's really about unity. So it's not only about harmony like we all get along. There's this unifying element here. We're unified by the Dharma. We come together around the Dharma or within the Dharma. And when we do that, it makes a collection of individuals into a community. So even though today we're all in our different places, actually around the world, somehow we are a unified community because we come together around this practice. So we don't lose our individuality. We can't substitute for each other. We each have our own kind of unique likes and dislikes and talents and abilities and experiences. So we don't lose any of that. It's not about sort of dropping what's unique about each of us, but somehow, even with that, we see how we're connected. We see how we function together, and how we're one. We are one thing in that we're one community. So if there's no separation, then the obstacles and the hindrances that can happen don't arise, or at least maybe they get resolved somehow. The barriers between us can come down a little bit. So in taking refuge, we return to Shikantaza, we return to Zazen, we return to the three treasures when we lose our way. And sometimes we do, right? I mean, we get caught up in our stuff and we really lose sight of the path and we can really lose our way. And when that happens, we know we can return to and take refuge in these three treasures because they are stable. They're not going anywhere. They will provide some shelter for us and we can rely on them. But these three treasures are not something out there. Something which is separate from us, not something that we worship in that way. We're simply recognizing that these three treasures and ourselves and all beings are not separate. So the three treasures are absolute reality, and this is where we live, right? We actually can't, in some ways, we can't pull apart these three treasures. They make up absolute reality, and we don't get outside of that. We can't get outside of that. This is our shelter. These three treasures. There's nowhere else we can go. So Dogen asks, why should we have faith in the three treasures? Because the three treasures are one's final refuge. So there's nowhere else we can go. All the same, it is easy to lose sight of this, isn't it? Sometimes we are feeling fearful, or we're feeling incomplete, or unsettled, and we can turn to a lot of things for comfort, or for protection, or refuge when we're fearful. We're looking for something else to save us from misfortune, to save us from suffering, to save us from our ideas. So Hojo-san has written that he thinks religion arises from two kind of human needs. One is to deal with our fears, and the other is to figure out how to get along with each other. That makes a lot of sense to me, right? So people 2,000 and 3,000 years ago were not any different than we are in that respect. They were fearful about dangers, things they couldn't control. And so, Dogen points us to a very old Buddhist text called the Abhidharmakosha, which says, many people fearing misfortune take refuge in the ghosts enshrined in various mountains and forests. This refuge is not genuine or respectable. By such refuge, we cannot be released from suffering. When we take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, we observe our life with wisdom based on the Four Noble Truths. We know suffering, the cause of suffering, and going beyond suffering forever. We also know the Holy Eightfold Noble Path and go to the peacefulness of nirvana. This taking refuge is most superior. This refuge is most respectable. By taking this refuge, we will surely be relieved from various sufferings. So people, in ancient times turned to ghosts and for other sort of fantastic beings because they seem to provide some way to have power over nature. Because as humans, we can't control nature. So we got to know, in the ancient times, just as in today, if a tsunami hits, a hurricane comes, there's a famine, there's a fire, there's disease. Here's nature doing something we can't control. So naturally, we feel fearful and we want to turn to something for some kind of help. to ease our fears, to ease our suffering. So Buddhism says if we take refuge in the three treasures rather than in some fantastic manifestation of nature, then we learn about the real cause of our suffering. And we learn something about how we can liberate ourselves and all beings from that suffering. So we bring about our own suffering. We can't look outside of ourselves or to some other kind of being to save us from that or to bring an end to that. We need to do that for ourselves. So Hojo-san says, not by simply worshiping something, but by accepting this teaching, we know how suffering is created and how it can stop. That's why taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha is superior to worshiping a ghost. So according to Hojo-san, don't go worshiping ghosts. Turn instead to the three treasures. So it may seem like our suffering isolates us from others, and especially in times like these. We can feel like I feel some pain that nobody else is feeling. I'm here by myself, feeling my feelings, worrying about the things that I'm worried about, or experiencing whatever I'm experiencing. But what I'm experiencing is not shared by anybody else. Because we know my physical pain can't substitute for anybody else's. I don't know what's going on necessarily in somebody else's mind, so we can feel like our suffering is ours to deal with, and nobody else's. And that nobody else is feeling what we're feeling. I feel pain, you don't feel the same pain I feel. So I can really sort of feel alone in my fear or in my discomfort, my unease. So this individual self that's suffering is part of the universal self, and that's where we go for refuge. So we're never actually alone in our suffering or with our suffering, because we're not disconnected from this universal self. We're not actually alone even when we're in quarantine, even when we're self-isolating and we're staying in our own homes. We don't see anybody else for weeks on end, except perhaps virtually. That doesn't cut us off from the universal self. That dynamic is all still happening. So we're always interconnected with this one unified reality. And we're always interconnected with these three treasures. Again, these three treasures are something on which we can rely and on which we can take refuge. So one aspect of the three treasures is Ittai Sambo, or one body, three treasures. And Hojo-san has talked about this a number of times. It means that the three treasures, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, are not actually separate. We can make some distinctions and say there's a Buddha, there's Dharma, and there's Sangha. But actually, in the absolute view, we can't pull these things apart. We can say that there are three expressions of awakening, three different expressions of one awakening. But this one body, three treasures also points us back to interconnection and the reality that we and the three treasures are connected across space and time into one body. So we're born, we live, we die within this one reality. There's no stepping outside of this one reality. So this reality is our home. This is our shelter. So when we're taking refuge in the three treasures, we're returning home. We're taking shelter there, in the place where we live and where we're born and grow and live and die. So we're giving up being pulled around by our ideas and our delusions, and we're returning to the way things actually are. So sometimes we can, again, lose sight of what's actually happening. We get caught up here, right? We get caught up in illusion and delusion and our ideas and all of that. And when we take refuge, we come back. So just like in Shikantaza, we keep coming back to this moment, coming back, and that is our Shikantaza practice. In that way, we're taking refuge again. So every time we come back to the three treasures, we come back to reality, we're coming back home. This is where we live, right? In this moment, in this reality. So according to Uchiyama Roshi, taking refuge in the three treasures is how we come to have a settled life. And as we know, the great question of Uchiyama Roshi's life and practice was, how do we find balance between peace and progress, right? Between our wanting to have peace of mind and wanting equanimity and balance and to be settled, and the need for progress and development and activity in the world. So how do we have a settled life in the midst of these two kinds of energy, maybe, or these two aspirations? So because everything is always changing, we know we can't rely on conditioned things forever. We'd like to feel that having certain things or people or circumstances in our lives makes our lives stable or makes our lives settled. But of course, all conditioned things are going to change and disappear eventually, and we can't rely on them forever. So these three treasures that make up this one reality is something we actually can rely on, something we can come home to. So we do many things on a day-by-day, moment-by-moment basis to protect this small self, right, and to enhance our self-concept, which is, again, a way of managing our fear, because this self feels very important. So how do I protect this self? There are many, many things we do on a day-by-day basis. But all we can really do is take refuge in the three treasures and give up trying to rely on this or trying to protect this small self. Because like everything else, of course, this is changing. This self is not permanent. There's no fixed permanent essence here. So if we take refuge in the three treasures and we look clearly at what reality is doing, and we give up clinging to these five skandhas, that's the nature of refuge here. So taking refuge implies that we stop revering this small self, clinging to this small self, and we look instead to things we can actually rely on, which are the three treasures. So Dogen Zenji says, what the Buddhist ancestors have authentically transmitted is reverence for Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. If we do not take refuge in them, we do not revere them. And if we do not revere them, we do not take refuge in them. So he's equating these two things, right? So to revere something is to have a deep respect for it, or to have a deep admiration for it. So we look to the three treasures for shelter. A couple of our echoes or dedications, we say, at the end, we say, may we find solace and strength in Buddha's way, right? So this is where we're looking for reinforcement, maybe. These three treasures give us a reliable foundation for living, right? For going forward on a day-to-day basis. So the last time I sat in this virtual chair, we were actually in the Zendo, we talked about gate 26, which was about Dharma conduct. And at that point I said that Dogen taught that having grandmotherly mind is not just about being kind to other people. It's also about, or taking care of other people, it's also about taking care of the three treasures by understanding that all of our actions, all of our conduct is the Buddha Dharma. So Dogen said, be mindful of the three treasures as a parent would be mindful of an only child. So when we're thinking about our conduct, our actions in the world, whatever we're doing is our way of taking care of the three treasures. So can we bring this approach to our activity that says, I need to take care of the three treasures as if I was taking care of an only child or my only child, and is my action, is my conduct in alignment with that? So we have to pay attention to all of our actions as practice. And this is another way that we are connected with the three treasures. So again, Dogen taught that practice and awakening are not two. We hear this teaching all the time. There is no awakening, which is outside of or separate from our day-to-day activity. So because these three treasures are important to us, we handle them carefully, right? I'm sharing this water with my cat, by the way, who just came up and drank out of my glass. Oh dear. So in the Bonmo Kyo, which is a text about precepts, right? It says, whenever a bodhisattva hears non-Buddhist or evil-minded person direct even a single slanderous word at the Buddha, he experiences pain like that inflicted by 300 spears piercing one heart. Like, ouch, right? You hear somebody slandering the Buddha or slandering the three treasures, and it's really painful because we've made a commitment to those, right? The 10th precept, when we take precepts, the 10th precept is about not slandering the three treasures. So when we take that vow, when we take on that precept, on the one hand, we're agreeing not to say bad things about the three treasures, right? Not to say that they're harmful or evil or mistaken or something. But Hojo-san says it's also an act of slandering the three treasures if we're practicing for ourselves. So if we're not recognizing this interconnection and we're simply practicing for some kind of personal gain, that in itself is slandering the three treasures. So here's what he says about that. Even if we are trying to be good students of Buddha, if we try to do so for our own sake, even slightly, we slander the three treasures. Still, if we stop practicing and sharing Dharma with others, again we slander the three treasures. We must examine what's there inside of ourselves, what makes us behave, practice, or act in this way. And if we find some defilement, we have to let it go and make repentance. That's how our practice continues and our awakening ripens. So even though we make vows, we intend to do the right thing by the three treasures, we can still fall into delusion, right? We can still make a mistake. When we stop paying attention to our actions and to our motivations, we can fall off the path. When our day-to-day activity becomes all about our craving and our aversion and our personal need to get something out of our practice, in that way we've stopped taking care of the three treasures as though they were our only child, right? In that way we're slandering the three treasures and breaking the precept. The three devotions are a gate of Dharma illumination, for they purify the three evil worlds. So let's think now about the relationship with these three evil worlds. The three evil worlds are the Sanakudo, or the three lower realms of the Rokudo. So there's the 6 realms through which we transmigrate in samsara. We're constantly transmigrating through these 6 realms. So these 3 evil worlds are the 3 lower realms: hungry ghosts, hell, and animals. That's where we fall into, right? So those 3 lower realms also are representations of our old friend, the 3 poisonous minds, right? Greed, anger, and ignorance. So in the Ekotaragama Sutra, it says, beings who take refuge in Buddha do not fall into lower rebirth. They cease from excess and dwell with humans and gods and will arrive at nirvana. So there's the opposite, right? If we take refuge, somehow we end up in the higher realms. So taking refuge in the 3 treasures, doing our practice, doing shikantaza and study, and doing some beneficial action in the world allows for our wisdom and compassion to manifest. The wisdom and the compassion are already there. Our practice allows us to show that, right? To bring it forth. So we see clearly what's happening. We can act skillfully in the world. So when we're practicing, we get to see how our craving and our attachment create suffering for ourselves, how we perpetuate that in the world sometimes, how we get pushed into those 3 lower realms. So in the hungry ghost realm, we want stuff, right? We want stuff all the time. Somehow our cravings and our aversions and things we want are never satisfied, and we're incredibly frustrated because we never get everything we want or we think we should have. So there's our old friend greed, right? In the animal realm, we're just trying to avoid pain. We're just trying to make ourselves comfortable. We're sort of complacent. We're kind of dull. This is ignorance. And in the hell realm, we can't escape from our anger, from our hatred, and from our ill will. We can feel claustrophobic. It feels extremely hot or extremely cold. Last time, when I was talking about these 3 lower realms, I said, the hell realms, golly, the Japanese are the masters of hell realms. There's hot hells and cold hells, and there's a million kind of hells, right, that we can fall into simply because we can't escape from this greed. From this anger and ill will. It sort of gets a hold of us. We can't escape it. So these 3 poisons and their attendant hell realms are the root source of our suffering, right? And the suffering that we perpetuate in the world, perpetuate for others. So these are not something that comes from somewhere else. This is not uncontrollable nature that somehow, randomly strikes us. This is not something that is outside of us. This is stuff that we create. So we put ourselves there into those realms, and we can get ourselves out. The good news is we can get ourselves out by taking refuge in the 3 treasures and by doing our practice on a day-to-day sort of moment-by-moment basis. So enough from me. What would you like to say? Please turn on your mic if you want to say something so that we can actually hear you. Does somebody have questions or comments? I hope if somebody's talking, turn on your mic. Okay. Maybe it's a bit unusual or difficult to have conversation by Zoom. Ah, there's somebody. Hello, our contingent from Austria. How are you?
Hello. Hi. Fine. The sun is shining.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Talking to you from the future. It's already
Yes.
Yeah.
It's evening where you are, right?
Pardon?
It's evening where you are, right?
No, afternoon.
Afternoon.
Late afternoon. It's getting late afternoon now. Yes.
I see. Okay.
exists.
Yes, the ground still exists.
Sit a little closer together, we can see you better. Although maybe you have to do social distancing. I don't know.
No. At the moment we live together. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm thinking. One of you has something, you all have it. All right, good. Any comments for today?
Yes, more or less an example from what we're experiencing right now.
Okay.
I have to say it's the first time I came across this idea of, dealing with the three treasures like they were your only child.
Yes.
And really moved me because, to keep it very short, I'm going through a hard time personally right now. And those two heard about it and they took me in. So this is Sangha in action, I'm being treated like a child here. No, not exactly. But it's really nice.
Oh, yes.
No, it's really nice because their daughter's staying here too. She moved out already. She's grown up.
Yeah.
And now it's like being, yeah. And that's really, as you said, like times like these where all these things get a little more, I don't know, concentrated, you could say. And this is really something I'm very grateful for having, this jewel that's protecting me right now.
Yes. Well, it's a great example, isn't it? Because talk about going to your Sangha for refuge.
Yes.
I mean, you're sort of literally doing that,
Literally.
You're literally doing that. But even if you weren't literally living there, Sangha's, I've always said Sangha, there's a reason Sangha is one of the three treasures. Sometimes we think, well, it's more difficult to practice with other people. I want to just do what I want to do. I don't want a teacher telling me what to do. I don't want to have to sort of give way to Sangha brothers and sisters. I just want to do my thing, especially in America, right? I mean, rugged individual, America. But somehow having other people on this path with us makes a huge difference. It really is a refuge. And especially in times like these where we physically often can't get the Sangha together, it's been really interesting to see how people have adapted to virtual practice. It does feel a bit like a refuge. Our Wednesday night book group was the first time we'd gotten sort of a bunch of people together. We had 11 people, together. And everyone was saying, it's so good to see other people. It's so good to see people who practice, and to see other Sangha members and to know that although we're practicing in our places, there is a refuge there, So I too, when I first came across that Dogen teaching about take care of the three treasures as though they were your only child, and the way we do that is simply in our moment-by-moment behavior, and our moment-by-moment conduct with ourselves and with our Sangha and with everybody. What an interesting frame for practice, because we're going to the three treasures for refuge, and yet we have to care for them. It's a two-way thing. It's not like I'm just going to take from the three treasures to keep myself going. We have to offer some care back in some way. So for us to think about what does that mean in my practice, I think is a really interesting question. So I'm glad you brought up your example. It's a really good example. Other people, comments, questions?
I have something kind of potentially related.
Hi, Doju. Hi, Ali.
So I'm now taking virtual Buddhist studies classes at the university, and we've this one class that I'm taking is called mindfulness, and it's sort of about the evolution of the term mindfulness, both in Buddhist history, but also in contemporary Western culture. And we're looking now at the Tibetan and late Indian Maha Mudra tradition, which is really interesting. It's very similar to Soto Zen. And one of the things that they do is sort of enumerate all the ways that we can kind of step out of the present moment. So this relates to what we were saying about kind of when we are doing shikantaza, that's sort of participating in this reverence of the three treasures. And I was reminded of one of them because in a sense we're sort of time traveling to Austria when we are talking to Andreas. And one of the things that they mention is time travel in our mind. So we're constantly placing ourselves in the future or in the past. And that's one of the ways that we can separate ourselves from the present moment, obviously. But it's interesting to think about how much time travel we do in our minds. So.
Yeah, it is interesting. And so when I was prepping for this talk and reading these quotes about, we're not separate from the three treasures in space, but also in time. I mean, that's an interesting perspective, right? So we're right kind of at this intersection. And it's certainly true that we spend, if we're sort of caught up in our thinking, so often it's about what did I do yesterday? What am I going to do tomorrow? What's that person going to say to me, right? There's a lot of time travel there. It's not always what's happening now in another place. It's memories, it's projections, it's planning, it's, that's an interesting perspective. Other comments? Questions? Stories? Hearing none. Speak now or hold your peace until next week. Okay. So let's do our closing chant. We'll do a couple of quick announcements, although there aren't a lot, because there isn't a lot happening. And wrap up for today, yes? So thank you very much.